Yeah, hey, hello everyone, and welcome Dave Snowden. Welcome to the Scrum Network webinar series. If you want to know more, go to scrumnetwork.com. There you find more information. Today we have a live interview with Dave Snowden, the creator of the Cynefin framework and also Chief Scientific Officer of Cognitive Edge. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So welcome to this interview. Thanks to you for taking the time. And yeah, Dave, could you maybe start with telling us a little bit about yourself and where do you get to where you, or how do you get probably where do you currently are?
I'm 66 on Wednesday, so it's been a long journey. All right. I didn't expect to spend my 66th birthday confined to home. Right. Last year I was on Cradle Mountain in Tasmania. Okay. So my background is my first degree. I went to university to study physics and philosophy, then kind of like focused on the philosophy. From that went on to work in a variety of World Council of Churches projects, and then moved into industry, initially in HR, then into finance, then in the early days of computing, into building and designing decision support systems. So I built the systems for people like Guinness internationally and the like. Yeah. There were very few people then with both computer experience and financial experience, so it was a good market to be in. I created a decision support business unit, and that's what my thesis is based on. How do you support people in making better decisions? Then as we did the management buyout of the company, I became strategy director, then IBM bought us. And so for 7 years, I was an IBM employee working research, and that got us into DARPA, both before and after 9/11, where we worked on weak signal detection in counterterrorism. And then I left IBM about 16 years ago to create Cognitive Edge, partly on the sponsorship of the Singapore government. And within that, we sort of continue the development of Cynefin and complexity theory as a concept, and then more specifically, the approach to distributed ethnography we created around weak signal detection with SenseMaker. So that's been in the last 16 years. So that's a potted summary.
Yeah, that's a very long and interesting journey. I heard that you said, I thought you did a lot about decision making.
Yeah.
How would you define a decision? So like, what's a
Well,
decision?
it depends. I mean, you can go to, if you look at Derrida, all right, which is relevant, and sorry to bring in philosophy at this point, Derrida basically says a decision is only made when you reach a point of impossibility. That's not his exact phraseology. So most of the time we make routine decisions, we don't think about it. But when the routine or the process doesn't work, then we have to think differently. And that's what I specialize in. So it's kind of like, you know, most of the time you can apply best practice, you can apply good practice, you can rely on expertise. But in conditions of extreme uncertainty or decisions of complexity, you can't do that. So you have to take a different approach. So a decision for me is actually not making a routine decision. Decision support is about how do you support people when the decisions are not easy.
Okay, so that sounds interesting to me. I've heard a definition that I liked. I would like to hear your opinion. It's from Annie Duke, a famous poker player actually. She said a decision is a bet on an uncertain future. So how would you?
No, I don't buy that. I think for a poker player it may be, but for a human being in a community with other human beings, it doesn't have to be that random. Okay. I think you can make decisions which are coherent, and there are processes for making decisions that human beings can use, which are different from an individual poker player.
Oh, great, thanks, Dave. So Dave, you're very famous for creating the Cynefin framework, and that's a framework that, especially nowadays, is quoted a lot. Could you maybe explain for our listeners that are new to the topic in easy language, what's that framework about?
Okay, so Cynefin identifies 5 major areas in which human beings will make decisions. And the basic principle is the nature of the decisions are different in each domain. Yeah? It doesn't have 4 quadrants, or worse still, 5 quadrants, as some people say. I worry for people's education when they talk about 5 quadrants, right? So if we look at the 5, all right, you start off in a state which is called disorder or confusion, which is the state of not knowing what sort of system you're in. I've just been writing a series of blog posts around this in the March series. And then you've got various exit strategies. So if you don't know what sort of system you're in, you might make the wrong decision. So if there's an obvious solution, a clear solution, then that's the clear domain of Cynefin. So that's like in Colombia, you drive on the right. Well, most of the time you drive on the right. I've been to Bogota. In the UK, we drive on the left. It's a simple classification device. Yeah. So kind of like, and in one of these countries, I do this, right? And that's the domain of best practice. Often, though, we need experts to make decisions. So we're in the middle of a pandemic at the moment. Yeah, you need epidemiologists who have high expertise. The problem is the decision maker doesn't have the expertise. So whereas for the expert, it's obvious, for the decision maker, it isn't. And that's called the complicated domain of Cynefin. And there you need to have competing experts. You need to actually trust your experts. You need to build decision processes in place. But that's a domain of what we call good practice. Yeah. From there, we move to the complex domain. This comes from complex adaptive systems theory. In a complex system, everything is connected with everything else, but the connections aren't fully knowable. So you have inherent uncertainty. So you can't apply best practice or even good practice. What you have to do is to do multiple parallel experiments to see what's possible, or we call them probes, which is more accurate. Which is, by the way, why Scrum isn't technically a technique for the complex domain. I'll come back to that in a second. It's not a matter of a single experiment or a series of iterations around an initial input. In a complex domain, you require multiple perspectives. So for example, one technique we use there is called trios. So rather than send out a systems analyst who will come with a whole series of biases, we send out a young prototyper with somebody who sees the system as a whole, an architect and then system tester, with a user trained to talk to IT people. And we might throw 15 trios at a problem for a week and see what they come up with. So you're deliberately using parallel, undefined probes to see how you can change the space. Yeah, and there's other techniques I can go through. And then in the chaotic domain, that's where there's no apparent constraint. So everything is random. If you can deliberately create that sphere, it's quite powerful for decision support. So we do work, for example, we're about to do this on COVID. So we present a scenario to 1,000 people. They all index it independently of each other. They're not connected. And from that, we can actually provide a measure of the coherence of certain ideas. And we can also find outlier ideas, i.e. people who are thinking differently from the norm. But if you fall into chaos accidentally, it's a disaster. So those are the main 5 domains of Cynefin: disorder or confusion, clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. A final point on this to make because this is a Scrum gathering, there are also liminal domains, i.e. states of transition. The huge power of Scrum is that it's a liminal technique in the complex, which makes things complicated. So what Scrum does is it takes a series of things which are kind of like almost there, but not quite. Then it runs them through linear iterations until it gets them right. And it manages that on a team basis over multiple such requests. So part of what we do with Cynefin is to take a multi-tool approach. Different methods work in different domains, different tools work in different domains. There isn't one universal tool which will apply for the whole of Agile.
Okay, but that's interesting. I guess that's also very interesting for our listeners. We have lots of listeners from the Scrum domain or from Scrum with Scrum background. And actually here at Scrum Network, we do a lot of work with Scrum. Just published a book called Your Scrum Playbook. And I reference Cynefin in that
very
book.
Nice of you. Yeah.
And yeah, well, it's a great work, no? Cynefin model framework, sorry. And you just gave us some ideas on how Scrum and Cynefin relates. And you also mentioned the COVID crisis, basically. So one effect of the crisis is that many people are at home, like you and I right now, and probably almost all of our listeners. So we have now a lot more of remote teams. Before there were co-located Scrum teams, now that are remote Scrum teams. Do you have any idea or recommendation or thinking thought, something how a remote Scrum team can benefit from the Cynefin framework?
Well, I think Scrum has always been able to benefit from Cynefin if it realizes it's not a universal solutions. So there are things you need to do pre-Scrum.
Yeah.
Right. So how you generate the backlog and how you do user requirements is an area where we have methods and tools. Yeah. Not everything needs to be Scrum. There are time box techniques and waterfall techniques which are perfectly valid. So if you want to take a brief summary, kind of like waterfall works in the clear space, time boxes work in the complicated space, Scrum works in the transition between complex and complicated, and there are other techniques for complex. In terms of remote working, I think actually that's fairly easy with Scrum because you can have teams working on things, a backlog, you can do virtual stand-ups. I think it finally breaks things like SAFe. Because you simply can't take that sort of mass participation approach in a distributed force. Yeah. I think it also encourages a multi-methods approach rather than a single method approach, and I think that's critical. So finding ways to work and also finding work. I mean, there's a major problem at the moment. I'm getting loads of emails in from people like got a big Scrum, Scrum capability, but we were working in the tourist industry. Anybody got any work for us? So areas which previously did very rapid development with continuous change are losing people. So I think with a bit of luck, I mean, COVID is good and bad, all right? It's actually a wake-up call for the human race. I mean, we're lucky it's a culling disease. It's not a killing disease. And it's not killing in the way that global warming is killing. So we've actually got a chance to find new ways of working and developing together, and we're launching some projects on that. I think it also means that people aren't going to go back to working in offices anymore. I think the sort of distributed working is going to start to become more of the norm. So that requires us to change some of our methods and techniques. Yeah. And as I say, I think Scrum translates into virtual working very easily, other techniques less so.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's also very helpful for us. And I would like to ask you, as an expert on basically this uncertainty question, a question regarding what do you think? Where do you go business models and business strategies from here? Like in this crisis, like we have the COVID crisis with one thing, we have to stay at home, but on the other side, we are close or are already in a recession. I think the oil price dropped below $20 yesterday, or day before yesterday. So we have lots of uncertainty around. What's your opinion?
We're doing a few things on this because, I mean, if anybody says this is what will happen, they're a charlatan, right? We don't know. We do know some things, though. One is that we will get through this, but we'll get through it with significant casualties. All right? So not as great as the 40% deaths that we got with the medieval plagues, but we're probably looking about 10 to 15%. And that has a major effect on the economy, as well as the destruction of the economy, air travel, and everything else. So technically, every major Western nation, in particular, is going to be bankrupt technically within 2 to 3 months. So the old economic models of neoliberalism, even if they could have survived, are definitely not going to survive this. Yeah, so basically people have had to fall back to the state. So things are going to change. So one of the programs we got running at the moment, which people are welcome to join, is we're about to run a 10-day fast trial for the UN. If this works, it may become a worldwide program in which senior leaders are keeping daily journals of what they're learning, the opportunities they're spotting, the things they might otherwise forget. because learning in a time of crisis has to be immediate. It mustn't be retrospective. If you learn retrospectively, you always imply causality. If you capture learning at the time, it isn't, right? So that's part of it. And then within that, we're going to do two of these sort of mass engagement processes. One is going to look at triage ethics, because doctors are making decisions as we speak to take some people off ventilators knowing they'll die to give somebody else with a better chance the ventilator. So we're about to do a major pulse on that to identify attitudes to that. And then we're about to start to build a narrative database of visions for the future post the end of COVID, post the end of the pandemic. Now, the idea on that is mass participation identifies patterns of expectation, but then critically, as I said earlier, the idea is to identify outlier patterns, people who are thinking away from the norm, people who are thinking differently about new ways that we can work together. So that's the program we're just starting. And there are related programs for families to capture the narrative of how they're surviving by being isolated, programs for government officials who've got idle hands. So there's a whole set of things going on the website over the next day or so.
And there are lots of points, it seems. One big takeaway for me from this is you have to learn fast and retrospect very frequently. I hope I understand that right.
You have to learn in the here and now as well. I think that's the critical thing. All right. I mean, two things we know on cognitive science is the way you remember things after the event is different from the way you remember them at the time. Yeah. And therefore, retrospective coherence is a real problem in the context of lessons learned after a crisis. So that ability at a company or an individual level to capture your knowledge and experience as you go is key. And we sort of have tools for that. Yeah. So that's one aspect. The other is that, and this comes from stuff I normally use at the start of presentations. Yeah. If you take a group of radiologists and you give them a batch of x-rays, and on the final x-ray, you hide a picture of it. Well, you don't hide, you put it in plain sight. You put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. Then 83% of radiologists don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. Now, one of the reasons we adopt the approach we do is if you look at broad patterns over lessons learned in the field as things happen, and then if you represent that data to distributed populations, yeah, to get multiple perspectives, you can find the 17% who are thinking differently. And that's what we need to do desperately in the moment. We need to find the people who are not saying the things people in power want to hear, but are saying things that they need to hear. And that's part of the focus of our work.
So yeah, that's a pretty good summary. So let me ask you one more question before we might give the audience the chance to ask 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to give a keynote talk at Latin America's first virtual Scrum Day this week, actually. And many other events have been postponed or canceled, while the Scrum Day, initially a physical face-to-face event, converted to 100% digital. Why do you think this event is important?
I think, I mean, Zoom and things like that are working quite well at the moment, right? I must admit, from a speaker's point of view, live audiences tell you far more than audiences where you can't see anybody. And that actually does have an impact, and we know there's forms of communication there. But I think it's good to carry on as normal. I think I commend you for not cancelling or postponing, which is what everybody else has done, but keep it going in some form. We all need to talk with each other.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So maybe we can spend the last 5 minutes here on some questions from the audience. And here's a Q&A, a question and answer button on Zoom. So if you have questions, please don't use the chat, use the question and answer panel, and I'll let Dave know what those questions are.
All right, I've got it open so I can see them.
Okay, and here you go.
Okay, so in terms of scaling Agile, I think if you go in order of horror, you start off with safe, which is basically anything that anybody wants to buy tagged onto a certification scheme which won't achieve any real change. And I'm prepared to defend that. I think safe is one of the worst things that ever happened to Agile. Yeah. Second, if you then go on to less, kind of like works okay, provided you're prepared to accept whatever Craig says and do it the way Craig has it with limited team numbers. Yeah. Disciplined Agile framework, more open, less structured, now linked with the American project management organization. So there's some issues around that. But I think all three of them make it, and then you get the Scrum at Stale stuff. You've got all the legal action going on at the moment around the Scrum Alliance. So, you know, one of your speakers is now being sued by the Scrum Alliance and everything else. It's all got a little bit scary, right? But I think all of them, what they don't recognize, and this is the key thing on Cynefin, is different systems require different approaches. So you don't scale by a single method in which everything is contained. You scale by frameworks in which you can actually accommodate diversity, and object orientation has something to play here. And the key thing to understand is you don't scale a complex adaptive system by aggregation or imitation. You scale it by decomposition and recombination. And that's the multi-methods approach. We need to stop trying to adopt a single framework with certification. And we need to start to give people multiple tools, see what they use, define the interactions between the tools, and that way we'll scale. And that way programmers make money rather than trainers and certifiers. And I'd like that switch to happen.
Thanks. I think that question is answered. There's one more from Augusto.
Okay, if you read the current blog post, you'll see that we're saying that people start in disorder. This is extended at the moment. I'm currently writing a booklet, which will hopefully be out this week with the EU Commission on how to manage in a crisis. So we're putting it together very quickly. But the key thing is to understand the disordered space, or now what we call the confused space, yeah, is where you start. So if you have a look at the blog post, the latest one in the blog series on my website, you'll find how you exit from disorder described as 6 moves, 5 legitimate, 1 illegitimate. And if you've got questions on that, feel free to put them on the blog and I'll pick it up. Yeah. Being in quarantine isn't designed to prevent chaos. I mean, if you're being brutal about this, then what is called a herd immunity strategy, which Britain is still trying, although I think it's ethically disgraceful, is let everybody get infected quick and let the weak die off. And that's what's been done in the UK, right? And also in Brazil and various other areas, right? Now that's actually quite dangerous. The reason we're quarantining people is to smooth the load. It's a queuing theory thing. It's a constrained work in progress thing. We need to reduce the load on healthcare facilities. Now, in countries which are prepared for that, so Germany, for example, has, I think, a 0.06% death rate over infections. Britain has a much higher percentage death rate because I think we've got 1 emergency bed for every 20 that the Germans have, and we're not testing. So the whole function about quarantine is to actually reduce the rate of infection, but not to prevent infection. And that's why it's been put in place. So it's a complex systems technique. It's not a chaotic technique. Yeah.
Okay, it's done.
Okay, I'll remind you that there are 5 domains. There are not quadrants. Sorry, Daniel. I just need to keep reminding people about that. If you're in doubt, assume it's complex as a general rule. So if you want some simple heuristics, if it's glaringly self-evident, why the hell are you talking about it? Just get on with it. Yeah. If it's somewhere where you would trust an expert to make a decision, it's complicated. Yeah. Anything else, it's complex. And if the evidence supports conflicting hypotheses, then you basically assume it's complex and go from there. Yeah. Oh, scaffolding. Somebody's been reading the blogs. Yeah, this is something which has come out of years of development. We're just launching a new approach to design thinking, which will have its first training courses over 4 half days in April. We've moved that virtual, so it's no longer a 2-day course. it's 4 half days, and actually the half days are going to be afternoons, so the US and Latin America can join. Yeah. One of the, apart from the concept of distributed ethnography, distributed ideation, and rapid repurposing of existing capability for novel purposes, which are kind of like 3 main areas of this, contrasting with IDEO. The other idea is scaffolding, and for me that's been the missing component in systems architecture and systems design. In that, working with people from MIT and RAND and elsewhere, we've developed a typology of scaffolding. So the idea is you don't build the end system, you build a scaffolding, and dependent on the level of the certainty, the scaffolding might be like steel scaffolding for a building, external, or it might be like a fungus which actually grows in the soil and sustains plants, but you can't see it. There's various types we've got. So you basically choose a scaffolding, then you define interactions around the scaffolding and let the system emerge from that. Now, this is a whole new approach to systems architecture, which I and others are working on, which also goes back to some of the object-orientated work, sort of pre-microservices approach, and says that people and organizations are objects as much as software. So they have inheritance, they have polymorphism, they have input-output. So if you have a scaffolding and you have things which interact with the scaffolding in consistent ways, then highly complex applications can emerge as a result. And that's kind of like where we're working with that. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Then
well, I can do the next 3 quickly, all right? So what we're doing with the mass surveys is make them available to all countries, and then we can do a comparison both at the event and before. There's going to be a booklet on how governments can make decisions. That will be out this week, yeah? And lean manufacturing, Kanban, I think I've never understood the Kanban Scrum wars. I mean, there's a famous phrase from Tolkien, which is doubtless to sheep, other sheep appear different, or to shepherds, but we have made no study. I mean, they all have variations on the backlog. They all chunk things into small units. They all get teams to have a degree of autonomy over processing. That's a really useful thing in one liminal domain with Cynefin, but it's a poor complex technique, certainly without different representations. Yeah. And it becomes complex the minute you start to see patterns, and there's mathematical ways to detect that.
Okay, yeah, Dave, thank you very much for your time. I'm definitely looking forward to your keynote at the Scrum Day this week. So thanks a lot. Greetings back to you there. Hope you stay safe and talk to you soon.
Yeah, okay. Cheers, guys.